Dave Ramsey's $1,000 emergency fund advice is wrong. Dead wrong. And if you're following it right now in 2026, you're walking straight into a financial trap that could keep you broke for years. That $1,000 he tells you to save, it won't even cover one real emergency anymore. Your car breaks down? $1,800. Emergency room visit? $2,500. Water heater dies? $3,000. You're going to watch that tiny emergency fund disappear in seconds. And then you're right back in debt, starting over from zero. I'm going to show you exactly why Dave Ramsey got this completely wrong, what it's actually costing you, and the real number you need to save to actually protect yourself in 2026. My name is Alex, and I'm a 32-year-old software engineer who spent years following conventional financial wisdom before I realized it was keeping me broke. I analyze personal finance strategies, emergency fund data, and real-world expense patterns because I refuse to accept that the advice that worked in 1995 still works today. If you're tired of following financial rules that seem to make sense but aren't actually getting you anywhere, hit that subscribe button. And if this video helps you rethink your emergency fund strategy, give it a thumbs up so more people can avoid this trap. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you had an emergency that cost exactly $1,000 or less? Your car broke down and needed $1,200 in repairs. Your dog got sick and the vet bill was $1,500. Your laptop died and you needed it for work, so you spent $1,300 on a replacement. Your water heater stopped working and the replacement cost $2,000. Your deductible for an ER visit is $1,500 before insurance even kicks in. Do you see the pattern here? Real emergencies in 2026 don't cost $1,000. They cost $1,500, $2,000, $3,000, or more. So if you're sitting there with your $1,000 emergency fund feeling proud because you followed Dave Ramsey's advice, you're actually one medium-sized emergency away from going right back into debt. And that's exactly the trap we need to talk about. Here's what's really happening, and this is where the math gets brutal. Dave Ramsey's baby steps were created in the 1990s. Back then, $1,000 had significantly more purchasing power than it does today. Using the official Consumer Price Index, $1,000 in 1995 is equivalent to about $2,000 in 2026. But we've already established that the CPI understates real inflation, especially for the things you actually spend money on during emergencies. When you factor in the real cost increases for car repairs, medical expenses, home repairs, and emergency services, that $1,000 from 1995 probably needs to be closer to $3,000 or even $5,000 today to provide the same level of protection. But Dave Ramsey's advice hasn't changed. He's still telling people to save $1,000, as if inflation doesn't exist and the cost of emergencies has stayed frozen in time for the past 30 years. Let me show you what actual emergencies cost in 2026. According to AAA, the average cost of a moderate car repair is now $1,800. Not a major overhaul, not a transmission replacement, just a moderate repair. The average emergency room visit, even with insurance, costs between $1,500 and $3,000 out of pocket because of deductibles. A plumbing emergency, like a burst pipe or a backed-up sewer line, can easily run $2,000 to $5,000. Your HVAC system stops working in the middle of summer? That's $1,500 to $3,000 for repairs, or $5,000 to $10,000 for a replacement. Your roof starts leaking? Even a small repair is $800 to $1,500. And if you need a section replaced, you're looking at several $1,000s. A veterinary emergency for your pet can easily exceed $2,000. And here's what makes this even more problematic. These emergencies often don't come one at a time. It's not like the universe waits for you to replenish your emergency fund before sending the next crisis your way. Your car breaks down in the same month that your kid needs an unexpected dental procedure. Your water heater dies 2 weeks after you had to take your dog to the emergency vet. This is real life, and real life doesn't follow a neat, linear path where emergencies are spaced out conveniently. So what happens when you have a $1,000 emergency fund and face a $2,000 emergency? You've got 3 bad options. Option 1. You put the remaining $1,000 on a credit card, which defeats the entire purpose of having an emergency fund in the first place. You just went back into debt, and now you're paying 20 to 25% interest on money you spent on an actual necessity. Option 2. You pull money from somewhere else in your budget, which means you're not paying your regular bills on time, or you're skipping important expenses like groceries or medications. This creates a cascading effect, where solving one problem creates 3 new problems. Option 3. You simply don't handle the emergency properly. You get the cheapest possible car repair that might not actually fix the problem. You skip the follow-up medical appointment because you can't afford it. You patch the roof yourself instead of hiring a professional. And now you've got water damage that's going to cost 10 times more to fix later. None of these are good options. And this is the fundamental problem with the $1,000 emergency fund in 2026. It's not enough to actually protect you from emergencies, which means it's not really doing its job. Now let's talk about the second part of Dave Ramsey's advice. Keep that small emergency fund while you focus all your energy on paying off debt. For some people, this means spending years, literally years, with only $1,000 protecting them from financial catastrophe, while they tackle $30,000, $50,000, or $100,000 in student loans, car loans, and credit card debt. Think about what this means in practice. You've got $1,000 in savings. You're throwing every extra dollar at your debt, which is great for reducing your debt balance, but terrible for your actual financial security. During those years of debt payoff, you're living on the edge. Any real emergency sends you spiraling backward, and you have to start the debt payoff process all over again. And here's what really makes this advice problematic. The types of debt matter, but the baby steps treat all debt the same. You've got a student loan at 4% interest? According to this system, you should be aggressively paying that off with a $1,000 emergency fund, even though that low-interest loan is costing you way less than the financial insecurity of having inadequate savings. You've got a car loan at 5% interest that you could easily afford to pay on schedule? Doesn't matter. Throw everything at it while you remain one emergency away from going backward. This one-size-fits-all approach ignores the reality that different financial situations require different strategies. Let me show you what happens in real life when you follow this advice. Meet Sarah. She's following the baby steps religiously. She's got her $1,000 emergency fund, and she's putting an extra $500 per month toward her $35,000 in student loans and credit card debt. At that pace, she'll be debt-free in about 5 to 6 years, which sounds great. But in year 2, her car needs $1,800 in repairs. Her emergency fund covers $1,000, so she puts $800 on a credit card. Now she's got new debt, and she has to rebuild her emergency fund before she can get back to aggressive debt payoff. This setback costs her 3 months of progress. In year 3, she has a medical emergency. The ER visit and follow-up care cost $2,500 out of pocket. She's rebuilt her $1,000 emergency fund, but now she needs another $1,500. Back to the credit card. Another setback. Another few months of rebuilding. By year 5, Sarah has had 4 or 5 of these setbacks. What should have been a 5 to 6 year journey to debt freedom has turned into 8 to 9 years because she kept getting knocked backward by emergencies that her $1,000 fund couldn't handle. The math doesn't work, and it's not Sarah's fault. She's following the advice exactly as prescribed. The advice is just wrong for the economic reality of 2026. Now, here's what Dave Ramsey and his followers will say. Well, if you had more discipline, you wouldn't keep having emergencies. But that's not how life works. Emergencies aren't a failure of discipline, they're a statistical certainty over a long enough time period. If you own a car, it will need repairs. If you own a home, things will break. If you're a human being, you will eventually need medical care. If you have pets, they will get sick. According to research from the Federal Reserve, the median American household experiences at least one significant unexpected expense every year. Not every 5 years, not every 10 years, every single year. And the average cost of these unexpected expenses is over $1,500. So the question isn't whether you'll face an emergency that exceeds your $1,000 fund. The question is when, and how many times before you finally build adequate savings. Let's talk about what an adequate emergency fund actually looks like in 2026. Financial advisors typically recommend 3 to 6 months of expenses, and I actually agree with this range. But here's the critical part that often gets overlooked. It needs to be based on your actual expenses, not some theoretical lean budget. If your monthly expenses are $4,000, a 3-month emergency fund is $12,000. 6 months is $24,000. That's a huge range, and where you should land within it depends on your specific situation. Are you a single-income household or dual income? Do you have stable employment or variable income? Do you have dependents? What's your health situation? Do you own a home or rent? The more risk factors you have, the closer you should be to that 6-month mark. Single-income household with kids and a mortgage? You need to be at the high end. Dual income, no kids, renting, both of you in stable jobs? You can probably be fine at the lower end. But here's what's not adequate. $1,000. And here's what's also problematic. Spending years with $1,000 while you aggressively pay off low-interest debt. The opportunity cost of this strategy is enormous, and it's costing people real financial security. So, what should you actually do? Here's a strategy that makes sense for 2026. First, save a true starter emergency fund, and that number needs to be at least $3,000 to $5,000, not $1,000. Yes, this takes longer to save. Yes, it means you're spending a few extra months paying minimum payments on your debt instead of attacking it aggressively. But you know what else it means? You're actually protected when an emergency happens. With $5,000 in the bank, you can handle the vast majority of single emergencies without derailing your entire financial plan. Your car needs $1,800 in repairs? No problem. You've still got over $3,000 left. Your deductible is $2,000? Annoying, but manageable. You need a new water heater? It's covered. This larger buffer means you're not constantly getting knocked backward and having to restart your progress. You maintain momentum on your financial goals instead of doing this frustrating 2 steps forward, 1 step back dance that leaves you exhausted and discouraged. Second, prioritize your debt payoff based on interest rates and your emergency fund status. If you've got high-interest credit card debt at 20 to 25%, yes, you should be aggressive about paying that off, even with a $5,000 emergency fund, because that interest rate is killing you. Every dollar in credit card debt at 25% interest is costing you 25 cents per year in interest charges. But if you've got student loans at 4%, or a car loan at 5%, or even a personal loan at 7 to 8%, the math changes. Your emergency fund, providing you with security and preventing you from going back into debt, is worth more than the interest you're saving by paying off these loans super aggressively. Here's a framework that actually makes sense. Save your $3,000 to $5,000 starter emergency fund first. Then, attack any debt above 10% interest while continuing to build your emergency fund toward the full 3 to 6 months. Once you've got both your emergency fund fully funded and your high-interest debt paid off, then you can decide whether to aggressively pay down lower-interest debt or invest the difference. This approach gives you real security while still making progress on debt. You're not vulnerable to every emergency that comes along, and you're focusing your aggressive repayment on the debt that's actually costing you significant money in interest. Third, remember that your emergency fund is not a static number. It needs to grow as your life changes and as inflation continues to erode purchasing power. That $5,000 that feels adequate today might need to be $6,000 or $7,000 in a few years. Your monthly expenses increase as you take on a mortgage, have kids, or face higher insurance premiums. Your emergency fund needs to increase proportionally. This is another problem with the $1,000 advice. It treats the emergency fund as a one-and-done task. You save your $1,000, check it off the list, and never think about it again until you're completely debt-free. But financial security isn't a one-time achievement. It's an ongoing process that requires regular adjustment. Now, let's address the psychological argument for the $1,000 emergency fund, because this is what Dave Ramsey's defenders always bring up. They say, the point isn't that $1,000 is enough. The point is that it's quick to save, and it gives people a win early in the process. If you tell people they need to save $5,000 before attacking their debt, they'll get discouraged and give up. I understand this argument, but I think it's fundamentally flawed. You know what's more discouraging than taking a few extra months to save an adequate emergency fund? Having an emergency 6 months into your debt payoff journey that wipes out your $1,000 fund and forces you to take on new debt. That's not motivating. That's devastating. People don't give up on financial goals because the initial steps take too long. They give up because they keep getting knocked backward and feel like they're making no progress. A larger emergency fund prevents those setbacks and actually increases the likelihood that people will stick with their financial plan long term. Plus, there's something psychologically powerful about having $5,000 in the bank versus $1,000. With $1,000, you still feel broke. You know that money isn't really yours because it could disappear tomorrow with one bad break. With $5,000, you start to feel like you have some breathing room. You start to feel like you're making real progress. That feeling is motivating, not discouraging. Here's another critical piece that the traditional advice misses: the cost of financial stress. When you're living with a $1,000 emergency fund, you're constantly worried about money. Every weird noise your car makes sends a spike of anxiety through your body. Every symptom you notice makes you wonder if you can afford to see a doctor. Every appliance in your house that's more than 5 years old makes you nervous. This constant background stress has real costs. It affects your health, your relationships, your job performance, and your overall quality of life. Studies have shown that financial stress is one of the most damaging forms of chronic stress, linked to everything from heart disease to depression to shortened lifespan. Having an adequate emergency fund doesn't just protect you financially, it protects you psychologically and physically. The peace of mind that comes from knowing you can handle most emergencies without going into debt is worth far more than the few months of extra interest you'll pay on your debt while you build that fund. Let me give you some real numbers on what this actually costs. Let's say you have $20,000 in debt at an average interest rate of 8%. If you pay the minimum payment, you're paying about $130 per month in interest. If you could throw an extra $500 per month at this debt, you'd save thousands in interest over time. Now, let's say instead of immediately throwing that $500 at the debt, you spend 6 months building your emergency fund from $1,000 to $5,000. During those 6 months, you're paying an extra $780 in interest charges compared to the aggressive payoff strategy. But you know what that $4,000 in additional emergency fund savings could save you from? A single emergency that forces you to take on $2,000 in new credit card debt at 24% interest. Over the course of a year, that new debt would cost you $480 in interest, and it would take you months to pay off while losing all your momentum. The math is clear. The small amount of extra interest you pay while building an adequate emergency fund is worth it for the protection it provides against much more expensive setbacks. Here's what I want you to understand. Dave Ramsey's advice worked for many people in the 1990s and early 2000s because the economic context was different. Emergencies cost less, debt was less common, wages had more purchasing power, and financial shocks were less frequent for the average American. But we're not living in that economy anymore. We're living in 2026, where everything costs more. Wages haven't kept pace, and most people are 1 or 2 emergencies away from serious financial trouble. The advice needs to evolve to match the reality we're actually living in. This doesn't mean Dave Ramsey's entire philosophy is wrong. The focus on getting out of debt is good. The emphasis on living below your means is good. The idea that you need an emergency fund before aggressively paying down debt is good. But the specific numbers and strategies need to be updated for today's costs and today's risks. A $1,000 emergency fund made sense when emergencies cost $500 to $1,000. It doesn't make sense when emergencies routinely cost $2,000 to $5,000. The baby steps need an update for the 2026 economy, and that update starts with acknowledging that $1,000 isn't enough anymore. So what's the right number? For most people, a starter emergency fund should be $3,000 to $5,000. Your full emergency fund should be 3 to 6 months of actual expenses, which for most middle-class Americans is somewhere between $12,000 and $30,000. These numbers might feel overwhelming, but they're realistic for the level of protection you actually need in today's economy. And here's the thing. Once you have this level of savings, financial stress decreases dramatically. You stop living in fear of the next emergency. You can make better long-term decisions because you're not constantly in crisis mode. You can focus on building wealth instead of just trying to survive. This is what real financial security looks like, and it starts with having an emergency fund that's actually adequate for the emergencies you're likely to face. Not the emergencies that existed 30 years ago, but the ones that exist right now in 2026. Let me give you a practical action plan. If you currently have less than $3,000 saved, make building that starter emergency fund your absolute top priority. Cut expenses wherever you can. Pick up extra work if possible. Sell things you don't need. Get to that $3,000 to $5,000 mark as quickly as you can. Once you've got that buffer, then look at your debt. If you've got credit card debt or other high-interest debt above 10%, start attacking that aggressively, while also continuing to slowly build your emergency fund toward the full 3 to 6 months. Split your extra money between debt payoff and savings, maybe 70% to debt and 30% to savings, or 80 to 20, depending on how high your interest rates are. If your debt is all lower interest stuff, student loans at 4%, car loan at 6%, you can take a more balanced approach. Maybe 50-50 between building your full emergency fund and paying down debt. The key is that you're making progress on both fronts, instead of leaving yourself vulnerable for years while you single-mindedly focus on debt. Once you've got your full emergency fund and you've paid off any high-interest debt, then you can decide what to do with lower-interest debt. Maybe you pay it off aggressively. Maybe you pay it on schedule and invest the difference. Maybe you do a combination. But you're making that decision from a position of strength and security, not from a position of vulnerability. This approach might take a little longer than the hardcore debt payoff first strategy, but it's actually faster in the long run because you're not constantly getting knocked backward by emergencies. You maintain consistent progress instead of this frustrating cycle of progress and setbacks. Look, I know this isn't the sexy advice. Nobody gets excited about saving $5,000 before attacking their debt. It's not as emotionally satisfying as the idea of becoming debt-free as quickly as possible. But you know what's really not satisfying? Being 3 years into your debt payoff journey and having basically the same amount of debt you started with because emergencies keep sending you backward. Financial advice needs to be realistic, not just motivational. It needs to account for the actual costs and risks you face, not just the costs and risks that existed when the advice was first created. The $1,000 emergency fund is a trap, and it's time we acknowledge that and do better. So yes, Dave Ramsey got this wrong, not because his intentions were bad, but because the economic reality has changed and the advice hasn't kept pace. $1,000 isn't enough anymore, and we need to stop pretending it is. If you're currently following the baby steps, I'm not saying you need to abandon the entire approach. I'm saying you need to adapt it to the reality of 2026. Save more in your starter emergency fund. Be more strategic about which debt you attack first. Build your full emergency fund alongside your debt payoff instead of waiting until you're completely debt-free. These adjustments won't make you debt-free quite as quickly, but they'll actually get you to real financial security faster, and they'll prevent you from the devastating setbacks that come from being inadequately prepared for emergencies. The goal isn't just to be debt-free. The goal is to be financially secure, with the resources to handle whatever life throws at you without going backward. And that starts with having an emergency fund that's actually adequate for the emergencies you're going to face. If this video helped you rethink your emergency fund strategy, share it with someone who's following traditional financial advice and struggling to make progress. And remember, you're not failing if the old advice isn't working for you. The advice is failing you by not accounting for the reality of costs in 2026. Now go build an emergency fund that actually protects you, not one that just checks a box on some outdated list of steps. Your future self will thank you when the inevitable emergency happens and you're actually prepared for it.